Rideshare driver risks everything to save country music legend. What George Strait did next changed this man's life forever. Carlos felt his ribs crack as he yanked the wheel, watching death approach in his rearview mirror, and George Strait's terrified eyes staring back. The rain hammered against the windshield like bullets as Carlos Mendonça gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. His Camry's headlights cut through the Nashville darkness, illuminating nothing but sheets of water cascading from the October sky. Another night, another dollar, or so he hoped. At 45, Carlos had learned that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, but desperation was a companion that never left his side. The notification chimed on his phone. A ride request from the outskirts of town, near the old industrial district where most drivers refused to venture after dark. The pickup location showed an address Carlos didn't recognize, but the fare estimate made him straighten in his seat. $43 for what looked like a straight shot to the airport. That was gas money, grocery money, maybe even enough to cover another one of Miguel's medications. Miguel, his 8-year-old son's face flashed in Carlos's mind, pale, thin, but still managing that crooked smile that reminded Carlos so much of his late wife, Maria. The rare genetic disorder that was slowly stealing his boy's strength had also stolen Carlos's savings, his engineering career, and most nights his sleep. But it hadn't stolen his determination. Not yet. Carlos accepted the ride and pulled away from the Starbucks where he'd been waiting, windshield wipers working overtime against the relentless downpour. The radio crackled with weather warnings, flash flood watch, severe thunderstorm warning, recommendations to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. Carlos almost laughed. Absolutely necessary was his entire existence now. Every mile, every fare, every risk was absolutely necessary. If you're watching this story unfold and finding yourself moved by Carlos's journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories of courage and transformation like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts as Carlos's extraordinary night continues to unfold. The GPS guided him through increasingly deserted streets, past shuttered factories and empty parking lots that reflected the storm's fury in puddles deep enough to swallow a small car. Carlos had driven these routes before, usually picking up late-shift workers or the occasional stranded traveler. Nashville's outskirts told a different story than the glittering country music venues downtown. This was where real people lived real struggles, where dreams came to die, or, if you were extraordinarily lucky, to be reborn. As he turned onto Industrial Boulevard, Carlos's headlights swept across a figure standing beneath a flickering streetlight. No, two figures. A man in an expensive-looking jacket held an umbrella over a woman in elegant clothing, both of them looking distinctly out of place in this forgotten corner of Music City. Carlos squinted through the rain-streaked windshield, something familiar tugging at the edges of his memory. He pulled up to the curb and rolled down his passenger window, rain immediately spattering his face and the worn fabric of his driver's seat. "Carlos, your Uber driver," he called out, his Brazilian accent still thick after 10 years in Tennessee. The man stepped forward, and Carlos's breath caught in his throat. Even in the dim light, even with rain streaming down his face, there was no mistaking those features. George Strait, the king of country music himself, was standing on a deserted street corner in the middle of a thunderstorm, looking like he needed Carlos's beaten-up Camry more than Carlos needed his next fare. "Thank God you're here," George said, his voice carrying that unmistakable Texas drawl that had sold millions of records. "We've been waiting nearly 30 minutes. Our original ride cancelled, and with this storm," he gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. The woman beside him, Carlos recognized her now as Norma Strait, George's wife of decades, smiled warmly despite the circumstances. "We really appreciate you coming out in this weather," she said, genuine gratitude coloring her words. Carlos quickly unlocked the doors, his mind reeling. Of all the rides, of all the nights, of all the storms in Nashville, George Strait was climbing into his back seat. The man whose voice had provided the soundtrack to Carlos's early years in America, whose songs had played in the background during some of his happiest moments with Maria, was now trusting him to navigate through what meteorologists were calling the worst storm system to hit Middle Tennessee in 5 years. "Airport, right?" Carlos asked, adjusting his rearview mirror to catch George's eye. "Terminal. American Airlines," George confirmed, settling back with Norma beside him. "We've got a flight to San Antonio that we absolutely cannot miss. There's a special tribute show tomorrow night, and..." He paused, studying Carlos's reflection in the mirror. "You know, you look familiar. Have we met?" Carlos shook his head, pulling away from the curb as carefully as possible. The standing water was deeper than he'd anticipated, and he could feel the car's undercarriage scraping against the asphalt. "No, sir, but I know your music. Been listening since I came here from Brazil. Your songs, they helped me learn English, actually." "No kidding." George leaned forward, genuine interest replacing the stress that had lined his face moments before. "What brought you to Nashville?" And there it was. The question Carlos had answered 1,000 times, each repetition wearing away at his pride like water eroding stone. Engineering work originally, had a good job with a construction company, designing bridges and infrastructure. Then the pandemic hit, company downsized and... He shrugged, focusing on the road ahead where visibility was dropping by the minute. "Now I drive nights, work construction during the day when I can find it." "That's honest work," Norma said softly from the back seat. "Nothing wrong with doing whatever it takes to provide for your family." Carlos glanced in the mirror again, surprised by her understanding. Most passengers either ignored him completely or treated him like an extension of the car's navigation system. "Thank you, Ma'am. It's just temporary, you know, until I can get back on my feet. My son, he's got some medical issues and the insurance, the treatments..." He trailed off, realizing he was sharing more than intended with strangers, even famous ones. "How old is your boy?" George asked. 8. Miguel. He's got this rare genetic condition that affects his muscles. Doctors say there are treatments, but they're expensive, and without the engineering job, without the good insurance." Carlos's voice tightened. He hadn't meant to turn this into a sob story. George Strait didn't need to hear about his problems. The storm intensified as they merged onto Interstate 40, heading toward the airport. Wind gusts rocked the small sedan, and Carlos had to grip the wheel with both hands to maintain control. The radio crackled with updates, multiple accidents reported, several roads closing due to flooding, emergency crews stretched thin across the county. "You sure about flying in this?" Carlos asked, glancing at his passengers through the mirror. "Might be safer to wait it out." George shook his head. "This tribute show, it's for a friend who passed recently. His family specifically requested that I be there, and I gave my word. Sometimes you honor commitments, no matter what stands in your way." Carlos nodded, understanding completely. Commitment was something he knew about, commitment to Miguel, to keeping promises to Maria before she died, to maintaining dignity even when dignity seemed like an expensive luxury he couldn't afford. They drove in companionable silence for several miles, the rhythmic thrum of rain on the roof creating an almost hypnotic backdrop to their journey. Carlos found himself relaxing slightly despite the treacherous conditions. There was something grounding about George and Norma's presence, something that reminded him of the people he'd grown up with in São Paulo. Genuine, unpretentious, the kind of folks who measured worth by character rather than bank accounts. "You know," George said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but I understand the struggle. Before the music took off, I was working ranches, doing whatever jobs I could find to keep my family fed. There were nights I wondered if I'd ever catch a break, if hard work was ever going to be enough." Carlos felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. What changed? Persistence, and meeting the right people at the right time. Sometimes the universe puts folks in your path when you need them most. George paused, looking out at the storm. Of course, sometimes you don't recognize those moments until they're in your rearview mirror. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden intensification of the storm. What had been heavy rain became a deluge that seemed to swallow their headlights entirely. Carlos slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 20, then 15. His hands cramped from gripping the wheel. The interstate had become a river, and other drivers were pulling over, hazard lights blinking like distress beacons in the darkness. "Maybe we should find somewhere to wait this out," Norma suggested, her voice tight with concern. Carlos checked his watch. "Your flight's in 90 minutes. If we stop now, you'll miss it for sure." He squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road markers. "There's a stretch of highway about 5 miles ahead that's on higher ground. If we can make it that far, the driving should get easier." What Carlos didn't say was that those 5 miles included a bridge over the Cumberland River tributary, a bridge he'd helped design 3 years ago when he still wore hard hats and carried blueprints instead of driving strangers through the night. He knew every stress point, every drainage system, every weakness in that structure. He also knew that in conditions like this, it would be the most dangerous part of their journey. But he also knew it was their only real option if George was going to make his flight, honor his commitment, keep his word to a grieving family in San Antonio. Carlos pressed gently on the accelerator, feeling the car respond sluggishly to his input. The water on the road was getting deeper, and he could sense the vehicle's stability wavering with each mile. Behind him, he heard George and Norma speaking in low voices, probably discussing whether to ask him to turn around, find a hotel, accept defeat. He thought about Miguel, asleep in their small apartment, surrounded by the medical equipment that had become as much a part of their home as furniture. He thought about the treatment his son needed, the hope that a new experimental therapy might slow the disease's progression. He thought about the $43 this ride would bring, and the dozens of similar rides he'd need to complete before he could afford another month of medications. "Sir," George's voice cut through his thoughts, "maybe we should—" The words were lost in the screech of tires and the horrifying groan of metal under stress. Carlos looked up to see a semi-truck jackknifing across 3 lanes of traffic directly ahead of them, its trailer swinging like a massive pendulum in the storm. The truck's driver had lost control on the slick pavement, and now 18,000 pounds of steel and cargo were sliding sideways toward their lane with the inexorable force of a natural disaster. Time slowed to a crawl. Carlos could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The truck's red taillights reflecting off the wet asphalt, the panicked face of the driver fighting his steering wheel, the guardrail approaching fast on their right side. He could hear Norma's sharp intake of breath, George's muttered prayer, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. In that frozen moment, Carlos realized he had perhaps 3 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether George Strait ever made it to San Antonio, whether Norma ever saw another sunrise, whether Miguel would grow up with a father or become another casualty of circumstances beyond his control. 3 seconds to choose between safety and sacrifice, between self-preservation and the kind of split-second heroism that transforms ordinary people into legends. Carlos yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The Camry responded like a living thing, tires shrieking against the flooded asphalt as Carlos fought for control. He felt the rear end slide out, the car rotating counterclockwise as physics and desperation battled for supremacy. Behind him, he heard Norma's sharp cry and George's instinctive grunt as they were thrown against the door panels. The semi's trailer passed so close to their front bumper that Carlos could read the shipping labels on its side. The smell of burning rubber filled the cabin as he wrestled with the steering wheel, his engineering mind automatically calculating angles and momentum, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. The guardrail rushed toward them with terrifying speed, its metal surface gleaming wet in their headlights. Carlos pumped the brakes in controlled bursts, a technique he'd learned from his father, who had driven delivery trucks in Sao Paulo for 30 years. "Never jam them on wet pavement," his father had said. "Let the car tell you what it wants to do, then convince it to do what you need instead." The wisdom of a man who had never owned a car worth more than $3,000, but who had never once been in an accident. The car's front wheels caught a patch of slightly drier pavement near the shoulder, and Carlos felt the vehicle respond to his corrections. He countersteered left, then right again, the motion becoming a delicate dance between man and machine. The guardrail flashed past his passenger window with inches to spare. "Hold on!" Carlos shouted, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to his passengers or to himself. The car was sliding toward the embankment beyond the guardrail, and he knew that if they went over, the 20-foot drop into the drainage culvert would likely kill them all. With one final desperate correction, Carlos managed to straighten the vehicle. They came to rest on the narrow shoulder. The car tilted at a precarious angle but upright, all four wheels still in contact with solid ground. The storm continued to rage around them, but inside the Camry there was suddenly only the sound of 3 people breathing hard and the steady patter of rain on the roof. "Jesus Christ," George whispered, his voice shaky. "How did you—" "That was incredible." Carlos tried to respond, but found his voice caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. A sharp, stabbing pain had blossomed along his right side during the maneuver, and each breath felt like someone was dragging a knife between his ribs. He pressed his hand against his side, feeling something definitely wrong beneath his jacket. "Are you two okay back there?" he managed to ask, turning carefully to check on his passengers. The movement sent another wave of pain through his torso, but he forced himself to maintain a calm expression. Norma was pale but alert, her hand clutched in George's. "We're fine, thanks to you," she said. "But are you all right? You look—" "I'm good," Carlos lied, shifting the car into drive and checking his mirrors. "Just need to catch my breath. That truck came out of nowhere." The truth was that Carlos was not good at all. During the violent maneuver, his seatbelt had locked against his chest with tremendous force, and he was fairly certain he had cracked or broken at least one rib. Maybe more. The pain was sharp and constant, made worse by every breath, every small movement. But admitting injury would mean stopping, would mean calling an ambulance, would mean George missing his flight and Carlos facing medical bills he absolutely could not afford. So he drove. "You saved our lives," George said quietly from the back seat. "That truck would have hit us head-on. We'd all be dead right now if you hadn't reacted so fast." Carlos nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a deep, aching throb that radiated from his ribs through his entire right side. He fumbled for his phone, checking the GPS. Still 40 minutes to the airport, assuming the roads stayed passable. "How long have you been driving?" Norma asked. Carlos caught her eyes in the rearview mirror and saw genuine concern there, not just politeness. "About 2 years, since I lost the engineering job. Before that, I never thought much about being behind the wheel. It was just transportation, you know? But when you're doing it for a living, you learn things. You pay attention to other drivers, to the road conditions, to—" He paused, wincing as another stab of pain shot through his chest. "To everything. Where did you learn to handle a car like that?" George leaned forward, and Carlos could see his reflection in the rearview mirror. The country star's face was etched with something between admiration and disbelief. That wasn't just good reflexes. That was skill. "My father," Carlos replied, grateful to have something to focus on besides the growing pain in his ribs. "He drove trucks in Brazil for most of his life. When I was little, maybe 10 or 11, he started taking me on short runs, taught me how to read the road, how to feel what the vehicle was telling you through the steering wheel and the pedals. Said driving was like dancing. You had to listen to your partner." "Smart man," George said. "He was. Died when I was in college, never got to see me graduate with my engineering degree, never met Maria, never knew he had a grandson." Carlos's voice grew softer. "I think about him sometimes when I'm driving late at night like this. Wonder what he'd think about his son chauffeuring famous people around Nashville instead of building bridges. I think he'd be proud as hell." Norma said firmly. You just saved 2 lives with skills he taught you. That's not nothing, that's everything. The conversation was helping Carlos manage the pain, giving him something to concentrate on besides the fire spreading through his ribcage. They had entered a slightly clearer stretch of highway, and he was able to increase their speed to 40 miles per hour. Still slower than ideal, but progress. Tell me about Miguel, George said. Your son. What's his condition called? Carlos hesitated. He had learned to be careful about discussing Miguel's illness with strangers. Too often, people responded with pity or unwanted advice or uncomfortable silences that made everyone wish the subject had never come up. But something about George's tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Carlos said finally. It's a genetic disorder that causes progressive muscle weakness. Boys usually start showing symptoms around age 3 or 4. Miguel was 5 when we got the diagnosis. What does that mean for him? Norma asked gently. It means his muscles get weaker over time. First his legs, then his arms, eventually his heart and lungs. Most kids with Duchenne end up in wheelchairs by their early teens. The average life expectancy is... Carlos stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Even 2 years after the diagnosis, he couldn't bring himself to say those numbers out loud. But there are treatments? George's voice was careful, hopeful. Some. There's a newer therapy that might slow the progression, but it's experimental and expensive. Insurance considers it investigational, which means they won't cover it. Costs about $3,000 per month, and Miguel would need it indefinitely. Carlos checked his mirrors, changed lanes to avoid a stalled vehicle. That's why I'm out here tonight. Every fare gets us a little closer to giving him a chance. Udud, the pain in his side was getting worse, radiating now into his back and down toward his hip. Carlos adjusted his position in the driver's seat, trying to find an angle that didn't feel like someone was grinding broken glass between his bones. The movement must have been more obvious than he intended, because he caught George studying him in the mirror with a concerned expression. You sure you're okay up there? George asked. You're looking a little pale. Just tired, Carlos said. I've been driving since 6 this morning, picked up a construction shift before that. Some days you just push through, you know. But even as he said it, Carlos was beginning to wonder if pushing through was going to be enough this time. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced before, sharp and constant, and getting progressively worse. He tried taking shallow breaths to minimize the movement in his chest, but that just made him feel lightheaded. How much farther to the airport? Norma asked. Carlos glanced at the GPS. About 25 minutes if this weather cooperates. He managed to smile. Don't worry, I'll get you there in time for your flight. I'm not worried about the flight, George said quietly. I'm worried about you. The comment caught Carlos off guard. In 2 years of driving for Uber and Lyft, he had transported hundreds of passengers, maybe thousands. Most treated him like part of the vehicle's equipment, functional, necessary, but not quite human enough to warrant genuine concern. The fact that George Strait was worried about his well-being felt surreal. I appreciate that, Mr. Strait, but I'm fine, really. Carlos tried to sit up straighter to prove his point and immediately regretted it as another wave of agony swept through his torso. Just focus on your show tomorrow. That tribute for your friend. Ray, George said softly. Ray Martinez. We played together for almost 15 years, started as my bass player, became my closest friend outside of family, died of a heart attack 3 weeks ago, 58 years old. I'm sorry for your loss. Ray had this saying, George continued. He used to tell me that life wasn't about the big moments, the sold-out stadiums, or the #1 hits. He said life was about the small kindnesses, the times when one person chooses to help another person just because it's the right thing to do. Carlos nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure where George was going with the story. The pain in his ribs was making it difficult to concentrate on anything beyond the immediate task of keeping the car on the road and moving toward the airport. Tonight, George said, you risked your life to save 2 strangers. You didn't know us, Didn't owe us anything. But when that truck was bearing down on us, you didn't hesitate. You just acted. Ray would have loved that story. Anyone would have done the same thing, Carlos replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced that was true. In his experience, most people's first instinct was self-preservation, not sacrifice. No, Norma said firmly, not everyone. Trust me on this. They drove in comfortable silence for several miles, the storm gradually beginning to ease as they approached the airport. The rain was still heavy, but the wind had died down, and Carlos could see other vehicles beginning to venture back onto the highway. His ribs continued to throb with each heartbeat, but he found he could manage the pain by keeping his breathing shallow and avoiding sudden movements. The airport exit came into view, illuminated by a collection of signs and lights that seemed almost cheerfully bright after the darkness of their journey. Carlos followed the curved ramp toward the terminal, his GPS announcing that they had arrived at their destination. American Airlines, right? He asked, pulling into the departure-level drop-off area. That's right, George confirmed. He was already reaching for his wallet. What do I owe you? Carlos glanced at his phone. The fare showed $47.38. The app will charge your card automatically, he said. $47.38. George pulled out a stack of bills and counted off several 20s. Here's $150, he said, pressing the money into Carlos's hand before he could protest. And that's not nearly enough for what you did tonight. Mr. Strait, I can't accept. You can, and you will, George said firmly. That's not charity, that's payment for services rendered. You didn't just drive us to the airport. You saved our lives. Carlos stared at the money in his hand, more cash than he usually made in 3 full days of driving. With tips, it was enough to cover Miguel's medications for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he stretched it carefully. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. George and Norma climbed out of the back seat, gathering their carry-on bags from the trunk. Before closing the door, George leaned down to the driver's window. Carlos, he said, I want you to promise me something. What's that? Promise me you'll see a doctor about whatever's wrong with your ribs. And don't tell me nothing's wrong. I've been in enough accidents to recognize when someone's hurt and trying to hide it. Carlos started to protest, but George held up a hand. Promise me, George repeated. A man who would risk his life for strangers deserves to take care of himself too. Carlos looked up into George Strait's eyes and saw something there that reminded him of his father. The kind of steady, uncompromising concern that demanded honesty. I promise, he said. George smiled and extended his hand through the window. It's been an honor, Carlos Mendonça. I hope our paths cross again someday. As Carlos watched George and Norma disappear into the terminal, he finally allowed himself to acknowledge just how much pain he was in. The adrenaline had completely worn off now, replaced by a deep, grinding ache that seemed to encompass his entire right side. Every breath was a conscious effort, every small movement a minor ordeal. He sat in the airport pickup lane for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The responsible thing would be to drive himself to the emergency room, get checked out, make sure he hadn't done any permanent damage during that desperate maneuver on the interstate. But the practical thing was to go home, take some ibuprofen, and hope that whatever was wrong would heal on its own. Hospital bills were not something his family could afford, especially not when Miguel's next round of treatments was coming due in 3 weeks. Carlos was still weighing his options when his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He opened it, squinting at the screen through eyes that seemed to be having trouble focusing. This is George. Got your number from the app. Are you okay? Carlos stared at the message for a long moment, touched by the fact that George Strait was checking on him, but unsure how to respond. He had promised to see a doctor, but promises were sometimes easier to make than to keep. Before he could type a reply, another message appeared. Carlos, if you're reading this and you're not already at a hospital, please go. Now. I've seen enough rodeo injuries to know when someone is seriously hurt. Don't be stubborn about this. A third message followed immediately. And don't worry about the cost. I'm serious about that. Just get checked out." Carlos felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, though whether from pain, exhaustion, or simple gratitude, he couldn't say. In all his years in America, through all the struggles and setbacks and small victories, no stranger had ever shown him this level of care. He typed back slowly, each letter requiring concentration. "Thank you. Going now." As he pulled away from the curb and headed toward Nashville General Hospital, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during that terrifying ride through the storm. Not just the pain in his ribs or the money in his pocket, but something deeper, something that had to do with the way George Strait had looked at him, not as a service provider or a means to an end, but as a person whose well-being mattered. Carlos had no way of knowing, as he drove carefully through the gradually clearing night toward medical attention he couldn't afford, that George Strait was already making phone calls from his gate at the airport. Calls to his manager, his publicist, his personal attorney. Calls that would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just Carlos's immediate circumstances, but the entire trajectory of his family's future. All Carlos knew, as he parked in the hospital's emergency entrance and tried to summon the strength to walk inside, was that he had kept his promise to a man who had treated him with unexpected kindness. And sometimes, as his father used to say, keeping your promises was the first step toward everything else falling into place. The automatic doors of Nashville General Hospital's emergency department whooshed open as Carlos approached, revealing the harsh fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell that he associated with Miguel's countless medical appointments. He pressed his right arm against his side, trying to minimize the stabbing pain that seemed to intensify with each step. "Can I help you?" The triage nurse looked up from her computer, her expression professionally kind, but tired. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and Carlos could see from the packed waiting room that it had been a busy night for emergency services. "I think I might have broken some ribs," Carlos said, his accent thickening with exhaustion and pain. "Car accident? Well, not exactly an accident. I had to swerve to avoid another vehicle and—" The nurse was already reaching for a clipboard. "Name?" "Carlos Mendonça." "Insurance?" Carlos hesitated. He had basic coverage through the Tennessee marketplace, the cheapest plan available, but the deductible was $8,000, essentially useless for anything short of a catastrophic medical emergency. "I have insurance, but—" He pulled out his wallet, counting the bills George had given him plus his usual cash reserves, maybe $300 total. "Can you tell me what this is going to cost?" The nurse's expression softened slightly. She had clearly heard this question many times before. "We'll work something out," she said. "Right now, let's just focus on getting you checked out. Have a seat, and we'll call you back as soon as possible." Carlos found an empty chair in the corner of the waiting room, positioning himself so he could lean against the wall for support. Around him, the usual emergency room drama played out. A teenager with what looked like a broken wrist, an elderly woman clutching her chest while her husband filled out paperwork, a construction worker with a bloody hand wrapped in a shop towel. Real people with real problems, just like him. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Elena, his neighbor who watched Miguel when Carlos worked late. "At hospital. Nothing serious. Home soon." He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want her to panic if he was later than expected. Elena responded immediately. "What happened?" "Miguel is fine. Sleeping. Do you need me to come?" "No, stay with Miguel. Just precautionary checkup. Thank you." Carlos closed his eyes and tried to find a position that didn't send lightning bolts of pain through his torso. He thought about the ride with George and Norma, about the conversation in the back seat, about the way George had insisted on paying extra and made him promise to get medical attention. In Carlos's experience, most people said things they didn't really mean, made promises they had no intention of keeping, but something about George Strait's manner suggested he was not most people. "Carlos Mendonça." A different nurse appeared, holding a tablet. Room 7. D. The examination room was small and sterile, dominated by a narrow bed covered with paper sheeting. Carlos struggled to climb onto the bed, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his right side. "I'm Jennifer, your nurse tonight," the woman said, checking his blood pressure and oxygen levels. "Tell me what happened." Carlos explained the incident with the semi-truck, the evasive maneuver, the way his seatbelt had locked against his chest during the violent motion. Jennifer listened carefully, making notes on her tablet. "Any loss of consciousness, difficulty breathing, nausea?" "No loss of consciousness. Breathing hurts, but I can do it. No nausea." "On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your pain?" Carlos considered. He had experienced plenty of pain in his life, construction injuries, the emotional agony of watching Miguel's condition progress, the grinding exhaustion of working multiple jobs to make ends meet. 7, maybe 8. Jennifer nodded and made another note. "The doctor will be in shortly. Try to rest if you can." Rest proved impossible. Every time Carlos started to relax, the pain would spike, reminding him of his situation. He was alone in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, facing medical bills he couldn't afford for injuries sustained, while trying to earn money for his son's treatment. The irony was not lost on him. His phone buzzed. Another text from the same unknown number. "George. Are you at the hospital? How are you feeling?" Carlos stared at the message for a moment. The fact that George Strait was awake at 3 a.m., presumably in San Antonio, checking on the welfare of an Uber driver he had met for the first time 5 hours ago, seemed almost surreal. "At hospital now, waiting to see doctor. Thank you for asking." The response came quickly. "Good. Don't worry about anything except getting better. I meant what I said about the cost." Before Carlos could type a reply, Dr. Sarah Chen entered the room. She was younger than Carlos had expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and an efficient manner. "Mr. Mendonça, I understand you had some excitement tonight," she said, washing her hands at the small sink. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." The physical examination was thorough and, unfortunately, quite painful. "Doctor." Chen pressed gently along Carlos's ribcage, asked him to take deep breaths, tested his range of motion. Each touch confirmed what Carlos already knew. Something was definitely wrong. "We're going to need some X-rays," Dr. Chen announced. "Based on what I'm feeling, I suspect you have at least 2 fractured ribs, possibly 3. The good news is that your breathing sounds clear, so we're probably not dealing with a punctured lung." "What does that mean for treatment?" Carlos asked. "Surgery? Most rib fractures heal on their own with time and rest. The bad news is that rest means no heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, and definitely no driving for extended periods. You'll need pain medication and probably 6 to 8 weeks of limited activity." Carlos felt his stomach drop. 6 to 8 weeks without driving meant 6 to 8 weeks without income. It meant falling behind on rent, on Miguel's medications, on the 1,000 small expenses that kept their fragile household functioning. "Is there any way to speed up the healing?" he asked. "I really can't afford to be out of work that long." Dr. Chen's expression grew sympathetic. "I understand, but pushing too hard too soon will only make things worse. Rib fractures that don't heal properly can cause chronic pain problems. Your best bet is to follow the recovery protocol and get back to full strength as quickly as safely possible." An hour later, Carlos sat in the same waiting room with a bottle of prescription pain medication, a packet of discharge instructions, and a hospital bill that made his head spin. Even with the payment plan the financial counselor had arranged, he was looking at monthly payments that would stretch his already impossible budget to the breaking point. The sky was beginning to lighten as Carlos walked slowly to his car, each step a reminder of his new physical limitations. The storm had finally passed completely, leaving the air clean and crisp and surprisingly cold. He sat behind the wheel of his Camry for several minutes, trying to work up the energy to drive home. His phone rang, George Strait's number. "Carlos? How are you doing?" "I'm okay," Carlos said automatically. then caught himself. Actually, no. I have 3 fractured ribs. Doctor says 6 to 8 weeks of rest, which means 6 to 8 weeks without income. But the important thing is that you and Mrs. Strait are safe. Did you make your flight? We did, thanks to you. Carlos, listen to me carefully. I don't want you to worry about money right now. Your only job is to get better. Mr. Strait, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm serious. I've already talked to my business manager. We're going to take care of your medical bills and make sure you have what you need during your recovery. Carlos felt tears start to well up in his eyes. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Actually, I'm insisting. George's voice was firm but warm. Carlos, what you did tonight, most people would have just hit the brakes and hoped for the best. You made a split-second decision that saved our lives, and you got hurt doing it. That makes you family in my book. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let us help. Say you'll focus on healing so you can get back to taking care of Miguel. Carlos sat in stunned silence, watching the sunrise paint the Nashville skyline in shades of gold and pink. In the space of 8 hours, his life had gone from predictable struggle to something he couldn't quite comprehend. Why? He finally asked. You don't even know me. I know enough, George replied. I know you're a father who works 2 jobs to pay for his son's medical care. I know you're a man who keeps his promises. I know you risked your life for 2 strangers without hesitation. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Mr. Strait. George. Call me George. George, I've been in this country for 10 years, and I've never met anyone like you. Most people, they see the accent, the old car, the fact that I'm driving for Uber, and they make assumptions. They treat me like I'm invisible, or worse, like I'm less than they are. Then you've been meeting the wrong people, George said simply. Carlos, can I ask you something? Of course. What did you want to be when you were Miguel's age? Before you became an engineer, before you moved to America, when you were just a little boy dreaming about the future? The question caught Carlos off guard. He tried to remember himself at 8 years old, running through the streets of São Paulo with his friends, full of impossible dreams and boundless energy. I wanted to build bridges, he said finally. Not just any bridges, but beautiful ones. Bridges that would connect places that had been separated, help people get where they needed to go. And you did that, for a while. Then the pandemic happened, and... No, George interrupted gently. You're still doing it. Tonight, you built a bridge between life and death for Norma and me. Tomorrow, when you go home to Miguel, you'll build a bridge between his fears and his hopes. Every day that you get up and work multiple jobs to provide for your family, you're building bridges. Carlos felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away since Maria's death, since Miguel's diagnosis, since the long series of setbacks that had brought him to this moment. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life had meaning beyond mere survival. I need to ask you something, Carlos said. The tribute show for your friend Ray. What would he think about you helping a stranger like this? George was quiet for a moment. Ray used to say that the measure of a man wasn't how he treated people who could do something for him, but how he treated people who couldn't. He'd probably say, I should have done more. There isn't more. This is already more than I ever imagined possible. Carlos, I want you to promise me something else. What's that? Promise me you won't give up on your dreams. I know things have been hard, but you're not done building bridges. Not by a long shot. Carlos looked out at the Nashville skyline, at the city where he had struggled and scraped and fought for every small victory. For the first time in years, it looked different to him. Not like a place that had beaten him down, but like a place where extraordinary things were possible. I promise, he said. Good. Now get some rest. I'll call you in a few days to check on how you're healing. After George hung up, Carlos sat in his car for another few minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. His ribs still hurt, he was still facing weeks of recovery, and Miguel still needed treatments they couldn't afford. But something fundamental had shifted. The crushing weight of desperation that had been his constant companion for 2 years felt lighter somehow, as if someone had offered to help him carry the load. He drove home slowly, carefully, the morning rush-hour traffic building around him. When he reached his apartment complex, Eleanor was waiting on his doorstep, still in her bathrobe, Miguel beside her in his pajamas. "Papa!" Miguel ran to him, then stopped short when he saw Carlos moving gingerly. "Are you hurt?" "Just a little, mijo," Carlos said, kneeling carefully to Miguel's level. "But I'm going to be fine. How are you feeling?" "Good. Elena made pancakes. Are you going to work today?" Carlos looked at his son's face, so young and trusting, and made another promise, this one to himself. "No, buddy. I'm going to stay home with you for a while. We're going to spend some time together, just the two of us." Miguel's smile could have powered the entire apartment complex. As Carlos tucked his son back into bed and settled onto the couch with his pain medication and discharge instructions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most important part of his story was just beginning. George Strait had saved his life in ways that went far beyond paying medical bills. He had reminded Carlos that he was more than his circumstances, more than his struggles, more than the sum of his setbacks. He was a bridge builder. And bridge builders never stopped working, even when the path forward seemed impossible to navigate. Outside his window, Nashville was waking up to a clear, bright morning after the storm. Carlos spent the next 2 weeks learning to live with limitations. The pain medication helped, but it also made him foggy and tired, so he took it sparingly, only when the stabbing in his ribs became unbearable. Miguel seemed to understand that his father needed to move slowly, and the boy had taken it upon himself to help with small tasks, bringing Carlos water, organizing his medications, reading aloud from his favorite books. "Papa, why don't you have to go to work anymore?" Miguel asked one afternoon as they sat together on the couch, sharing a bowl of popcorn while watching cartoons. Carlos considered how to answer. Miguel knew that money was always tight, that Papa worked long hours to pay for medicines and rent and groceries. How could he explain that a famous singer was now paying their bills? "Sometimes," Carlos said carefully, "when you help someone in a big way, they want to help you back. I helped some people a couple weeks ago, and now they're helping our family. Like when I helped Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries and she gave me cookies. Exactly like that, but bigger." Miguel nodded solemnly. "Are they nice people?" "Very nice people." What Carlos didn't tell his son was that George Strait's help had already extended far beyond medical bills. A check had arrived 3 days after the hospital visit, enough to cover 2 months of rent and Miguel's medications, with money left over for groceries and utilities. The note that came with it was handwritten on simple stationery: "For the bridge builder and his son. More help is coming. Get well soon. George." Carlos had stared at that note for nearly an hour, reading it over and over, trying to believe that this was really happening to him. The second surprise came a week later in the form of a phone call from Dr. Patricia Williams at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. "Mr. Mendonça, I understand your son Miguel has Duchenne muscular dystrophy." "Yes, that's correct." Carlos had grown wary of calls from medical professionals. They usually meant more appointments, more tests, more expenses he couldn't afford. "I've been asked to contact you about a potential treatment protocol that might benefit Miguel. Are you familiar with the experimental gene therapy trials that are currently underway?" Carlos sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge in his ribs. "I've heard about them, but our insurance doesn't cover experimental treatments." "This wouldn't involve your insurance. I have a benefactor who has specifically requested that Miguel be considered for the program. With all expenses covered, the treatments would be free of charge." "I don't understand. Who would do that?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I can tell you that this person was very moved by your family's story and wants to help. The question is whether you'd be interested in having Miguel evaluated for the program." Carlos felt his hands shaking. The gene therapy trials represented the most promising treatment for Duchenne that had emerged in years. Early results suggested the treatment could significantly slow the progression of muscle weakness, potentially adding years to affected children's lives. But the cost was astronomical, far beyond anything Carlos could have hoped to afford. Dr. Williams, are you saying this treatment could help Miguel get stronger? I'm saying it could help him stay strong longer. The therapy works by introducing functional copies of the dystrophin gene that Miguel's body doesn't produce naturally. In the trial patients we've seen so far, the treatment has slowed muscle deterioration considerably. Carlos closed his eyes, trying to process what he was hearing. When would this start? If Miguel qualifies, we could begin as early as next month. The program involves intensive monitoring for the first 6 months, then regular follow-up appointments. It's a significant commitment, but the early results have been very encouraging. After Dr. Williams hung up, Carlos sat in his kitchen holding the phone, tears streaming down his face. In the space of 3 weeks, his life had transformed from desperate struggle to something approaching miracle. He thought about calling George to thank him, but the magnitude of this gift left him speechless. Instead, he found Miguel in his bedroom, working on a puzzle. "Mijo, how would you like to try a new medicine that might help you feel stronger?" Miguel looked up, his thin face brightening. "Really? Would it help me run faster?" "Maybe, buddy. Maybe it would." The third surprise came on a Thursday afternoon when Carlos was strong enough to venture out for groceries. He was loading bags into his car when his phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. "Mr. Mendonça, this is Jennifer Walsh from George Strait Productions. Mr. Strait asked me to call you." "Is everything all right?" Carlos asked, suddenly worried that something had happened to George. "Oh, everything's fine. Actually, Mr. Strait has a proposition for you. He wondered if you might be interested in meeting with him tomorrow afternoon to discuss a potential job opportunity." Carlos nearly dropped his phone. "A job opportunity?" "Yes, sir. Something in his production company that would utilize your engineering background. Are you available to meet tomorrow at 2 o'clock? Yes, absolutely. Where?" "His office on Music Row. I'll text you the address. Mr. Strait is very excited to talk with you." That night, Carlos lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing despite the late hour. 3 weeks ago, he had been a desperate man driving strangers through a storm to earn money for his son's medications. Now Miguel was entering a cutting-edge treatment program. Their bills were paid, and George Strait wanted to offer him a job. It felt too good to be true, like something that happened to other people in movies or books, not to immigrant fathers struggling to make ends meet in Nashville. The next afternoon, Carlos stood outside a sleek office building on Music Row, wearing his best shirt and the one tie he owned. His ribs were still tender, but he had skipped the pain medication that morning so his mind would be clear. George Strait's office was smaller than Carlos had expected, filled with gold records and family photos, rather than the ostentatious display of wealth he had imagined. George himself was dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking more like a rancher than a country music superstar. "Carlos!" George stood and embraced him carefully, mindful of his healing ribs. "You look good, son. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you." "George, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for Miguel, for our family." "You already thanked me," George interrupted. "You thanked me by keeping your promise to get medical attention. You thanked me by letting us help. Now let's talk about the future." George gestured for Carlos to sit in one of 2 leather chairs facing his desk. "Tell me about your engineering background. What kind of projects did you work on?" For the next hour, Carlos found himself describing his career in detail. The bridge designs he had contributed to, the structural analysis software he had mastered, the project management experience he had gained. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated a genuine understanding of technical concepts. "Here's what I'm thinking," George said finally. "My production company is expanding into larger venues, more complex stage setups. We need someone who can handle the structural engineering aspects, make sure our stages are safe for performers and audiences alike. The job would involve travel, not constant but regular trips to venues around the country. Carlos felt his heart racing. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a career. The position starts at $75,000 annually, plus benefits, plus travel expenses. You'd work closely with our production designers, our lighting engineers, our sound technicians. Basically, you'd be responsible for making sure that when we set up a stage, it stays up. Carlos stared at George, trying to process the numbers he had just heard. $75,000 was more than double what he had earned in his best year as an Uber driver combined with construction work. George, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you're ready to get back to building bridges, musical bridges that connect artists with audiences. What about Miguel? His treatments? The job comes with excellent health insurance that will cover everything Miguel needs. Plus, our home base is right here in Nashville, so he won't have to change doctors or schools. When I do need you to travel, it's usually just for a few days at a time. Carlos felt the same sensation he had experienced in the hospital, something breaking open in his chest, some barrier between his current reality and the life he had dreamed of for his family. I accept, he said quietly. I accept with all my heart. George smiled and pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. I was hoping you'd say that. These are the employment contracts, benefit information, everything you'll need to get started. Your first assignment is actually going to be right here in Nashville. We're planning a special concert at the Bridgestone Arena next month, and I want you to oversee the stage construction. As Carlos flipped through the paperwork, one detail caught his eye. What's this special concert for? It's a benefit show, George explained. We're raising money for families dealing with rare genetic disorders in children. I thought Miguel might like to attend, maybe even come up on stage during the performance. Carlos looked up at George with tears in his eyes. You're going to help other families like mine. We're going to help other families like yours. This is your project too, Carlos. You know better than anyone what these families are going through. That evening, Carlos sat at his kitchen table with the employment contract spread in front of him, Miguel beside him working on homework. His son's latest round of gene therapy had begun the week before, and already the doctors were reporting encouraging signs. Miguel's muscle strength tests had remained stable for the first time in months, and his energy levels were noticeably improved. Papa, are you going to build stages for concerts? Miguel asked, looking up from his math worksheet. I think so, buddy. Does that sound exciting to you? Very exciting. Will I get to see the concerts? I think that can be arranged. Carlos signed the contract with a pen George had given him, a simple silver ballpoint with his initials engraved on the side. As he wrote his name on the signature line, he thought about the conversation he'd had with George about building bridges. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just surviving. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena next door. Carlos, Miguel's doctor called. They want to schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss his progress. She sounded very pleased with the results so far. Carlos closed his eyes and said a prayer of gratitude to God, to fate, to George Strait, to whatever force had brought a semi-truck sliding across an interstate on a stormy night 3 weeks ago. He had saved 2 lives in that moment, but in return, they had saved his. The next morning, Carlos woke up before dawn, not from anxiety or financial worry as he had for the past 2 years, but from excitement. He had work to do, real work, meaningful work, work that would utilize his skills and support his family and contribute to something larger than himself. He made coffee and stood at his kitchen window, watching Nashville come alive in the distance. Somewhere out there, George Strait was probably awake too, preparing for another day of making music and changing lives. Somewhere else, other families were struggling with medical bills and impossible choices, just as Carlos had been struggling 3 weeks ago. But today was different. Today, Carlos Mendonça was no longer just surviving. He was building bridges again, and the view from this side of the storm was better than he had ever dared to imagine. As he got dressed for his first day at George Strait Productions, Carlos caught sight of himself in the bedroom mirror. The man looking back at him stood straighter, smiled easier, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had work to do and people who believed in his ability to do it well. Miguel appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school. "Papa, you look happy." "I am happy, mijo, very, very happy." "Because of the new job?" Carlos knelt down to Miguel's level, marveling at how much easier the movement had become as his ribs healed. "Because of you, because of our new friends, because sometimes when you help people, they help you back in ways you never expected, like a circle." "Exactly like a circle, buddy, exactly like a circle." As they walked to the school bus stop together, Carlos realized that the most extraordinary part of his story wasn't what had already happened, but what was still to come. George Strait had given him more than money or medical care or even a job. He had given him back his sense of purpose, his belief in the future, his faith that good things were possible even for ordinary people who just tried to do the right thing. And in 2 weeks, when that benefit concert took place at the Bridgestone Arena, Carlos would stand in the wings, watching George perform for thousands of people, knowing that he had helped build the stage that made it all possible. The circle would be complete. 2 weeks later, Carlos stood backstage at the Bridgestone Arena, wearing a hard hat and safety vest over his best shirt, watching his engineering team make final adjustments to the massive stage he had designed and overseen. The structure was a marvel of modern concert engineering, 40 feet deep, 60 feet wide, with lighting rigs that could support over 2 tons of equipment. But more than that, it was solid. Carlos had personally inspected every joint, every support beam, every safety cable. This stage would hold. "Looking good, boss," said Tommy Richardson, the head of the rigging crew. In the past 2 weeks, Carlos had earned the respect of George's entire production team through a combination of technical expertise and the kind of quiet leadership he had learned managing construction projects in his previous life. "Never seen anyone so thorough with the calculations." "When George Strait is performing on your stage," Carlos replied, adjusting a support cable that was perfectly fine but checking it anyway. "Thorough is the only option." The arena was filling up with 20,000 country music fans, but tonight's audience was different from a typical concert crowd. Scattered throughout the venue were families like Carlos's own, parents and children dealing with rare genetic disorders, people who understood the daily struggle of medical appointments and insurance battles, and the constant fear that time was running out. George had personally ensured that several hundred tickets were reserved for these families, free of charge. Miguel was somewhere in the VIP section with Elena, wearing his favorite button-down shirt and a smile that hadn't left his face since learning he would get to meet George Strait in person. The gene therapy treatments were working better than anyone had dared hope. Miguel's latest muscle function tests showed not just stabilization, but actual improvement, something the doctors had called remarkable and unprecedented. "Carlos!" George appeared beside the stage, dressed in his performance outfit, black jeans, white shirt, black hat. Even after working with him for 2 weeks, Carlos still felt a small thrill at seeing the man who had transformed his family's life. "How's everything looking?" "Perfect," Carlos said. "I've checked everything 3 times. This stage will support whatever you want to do up there." George clapped him on the shoulder. "I never doubted it. Listen, there's something I want to discuss with you before the show starts." They walked to a quiet corner backstage, away from the controlled chaos of pre-show preparation. George's expression was serious, but warm, the look of someone about to share important news. "Carlos, you've exceeded every expectation over the past 2 weeks. The stage design is brilliant, your management of the crew has been flawless, and everyone who works with you comes away impressed. You're not just an employee anymore, you're family. George, working for you has been the greatest privilege of my professional life. That's what I want to talk to you about." This benefit concert we're doing tonight, it's not going to be a one-time thing. I want to make it an annual event, maybe expand it to other cities. And I want you to be in charge of the whole operation, not just the engineering, but the logistics, the venue selection, everything. Carlos felt his breath catch. You mean, I'm promoting you. Director of Special Events for George Strait Productions. The position comes with a salary increase to $90,000 annually, plus performance bonuses, plus the satisfaction of knowing you're helping families who are going through exactly what you went through. George, I don't know if I'm qualified to... You're the most qualified person I know, George interrupted. You understand the mission because you've lived it. You have the technical skills to execute it, and you have the heart to make it meaningful. Before Carlos could respond, a stagehand approached with a headset. Mr. Strait, 5 minutes to showtime. George nodded and turned back to Carlos. There's one more thing. During tonight's show, I want to tell the audience about what happened the night we met. I want to call you up on stage and introduce you as the man who saved our lives and inspired this entire benefit series. Oh, Carlos felt his knees go weak. George, I can't. 20,000 people. 20,000 people who need to hear your story. 20,000 people who need to know that courage and kindness still exist in this world. George's voice grew soft but insistent. Carlos, you've spent your whole life building bridges. Tonight, I'm asking you to be one. The concert began with George's classic hits, the songs that had made him a legend. Carlos watched from the wings, marveling at the way 20,000 voices could join together in perfect harmony, creating something larger than the sum of its parts. Between songs, George shared stories about the families in attendance, about the research being funded by tonight's proceeds, about the hope that medical advances could give to children and parents facing impossible diagnoses. Midway through the show, George's tone grew more personal. Folks, I want to tell you about a night 3 weeks ago that changed my life, he began, his voice carrying easily through the arena's sound system. My wife Norma and I were caught in the worst storm Nashville had seen in years, and we had to get to the airport for a flight we couldn't miss. Our original ride had cancelled, but one driver was brave enough to come out in that weather to help us. Carlos felt his heart racing as George continued the story. The semi-truck, the evasive maneuver, the way Carlos had risked his own safety to protect his passengers. The arena had grown completely quiet. 20,000 people hanging on every word. That driver's name is Carlos Mendonça, and he's here with us tonight. Carlos is an engineer, a father, and the bravest man I've ever met. When I learned that he was working 2 jobs to pay for his son's medical treatment, I knew that fate had brought us together for a reason. George paused, scanning the crowd. Carlos saved our lives that night, but what he didn't know was that he was also about to save his own life and his son's life in ways he never could have imagined. Carlos, would you please come out here? For a moment, Carlos couldn't move. The idea of walking onto that stage in front of all those people seemed impossible. But then he thought about Miguel in the audience, about all the other families who were struggling just as he had struggled, about the bridge George was asking him to become. He stepped into the lights. The applause was thunderous, but what struck Carlos most was the warmth of it, the genuine affection from people who had never met him, but who understood his story because it was their story too. George embraced him at center stage, then handed him a microphone. "Tell them about Miguel," George said quietly. Carlos looked out at the sea of faces, many of them families dealing with their own medical challenges, their own financial fears, their own desperate hopes. He thought about the night of the storm, about the split-second decision that had changed everything, about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice shaking slightly, I was just trying to earn enough money to buy my son's medicine for another month. Miguel has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I was working as an Uber driver, driving strangers around Nashville, hoping that maybe if I worked hard enough, long enough, I could give him a chance at a normal life. The arena was completely silent now. 20,000 people focused on one man's story. I picked up 2 passengers in a storm, and when a truck almost hit us, I did what any father would do. I tried to protect the people in my car. I never thought about being brave. I just thought about getting everyone home safely. Carlos paused, looking at George. What I didn't know was that those 2 passengers would become my family's guardian angels. He told them about the hospital, about George's phone calls, about the gene therapy that was giving Miguel a future he had never dared hope for. He told them about the job that had restored not just his income, but his sense of purpose. He told them about the benefit concert they were attending, how it would help other families avoid the desperation he had lived with for 2 years. Sometimes, Carlos concluded, his voice growing stronger with each word, the worst storms of our lives lead us to the most beautiful destinations. Tonight, looking at all of you, seeing the hope in this room, I know that no family has to face these challenges alone. We build bridges for each other. We carry each other across the difficult places, and together we make miracles possible. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. As Carlos walked backstage, his face wet with tears, he saw Miguel standing in the VIP section, clapping with all his strength, his thin face radiant with pride for his father. Later, after George had finished his set and the last notes of Amarillo Morning had faded into the Nashville night, Carlos found himself in the VIP reception area, surrounded by families whose stories echoed his own. Parents shared their struggles and their hopes. Children compared their treatments and their dreams. The room buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when people realize they are not alone. "Papa!" Miguel appeared at his side, still glowing from the excitement of the evening. "You were on the stage. Everyone clapped for you." "They were clapping for all of us, mijo. For everyone who refuses to give up, who keeps fighting, who helps each other through the hard times." Miguel hugged his father's legs, and Carlos was amazed by the strength in that embrace. The treatments were working. His son was getting stronger, not weaker. The future that had once seemed so frightening now stretched ahead of them, full of possibility. George approached with Norma at his side. "Carlos, I have something for you." He handed over an envelope. "This is the total raised by tonight's concert. $430,000 for rare disease research and family support." Carlos stared at the number, hardly able to comprehend it. "George, this will help so many families. It's just the beginning," George said. "Next year we'll do it bigger, reach more people, raise more money, and you're going to make it happen." As the evening wound down and families began to head home, Carlos stood in the empty arena with Miguel sleeping in his arms. The massive stage he had designed and built loomed in the darkness, but it no longer looked like just a collection of steel and lights. It looked like what it really was, a bridge between one family's desperate need and thousands of other families' capacity for generosity. George appeared beside him one last time. "So, how does it feel to be famous?" Carlos laughed quietly, careful not to wake Miguel. "I don't want to be famous. I just want to keep building bridges." "Good answer," George said. "That's exactly what we're going to do." 6 months later, Carlos stood in his new office at George Strait Productions, reviewing plans for benefit concerts in Austin, Houston, and Dallas. Miguel's medical chart showed continued improvement. His muscle function tests were stable, his energy levels were good, and his doctors were cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. On his desk was a framed photo from the night of the first benefit concert, George at the microphone, Carlos beside him, both of them looking out at 20,000 people who had come together to support families in need. Next to it was a letter from a mother in Memphis, whose daughter had been able to enter a clinical trial because of funding from their events. "Papa, are you ready to go?" Miguel appeared in the doorway, his school backpack slung over his shoulder. He was walking stronger now, moving with more confidence than he had shown in years. "Ready, buddy," Carlos said, gathering his jacket and keys. These days, he drove Miguel to school every morning before heading to the office. It was one of the small privileges of his new life. Time to spend with his son, time to be present for the moments that mattered. As they walked to the car, Miguel asked, "Papa, do you ever think about that night in the storm?" Carlos considered the question. He thought about it every day, actually. Not the terror or the pain, but the moment when everything changed, when a split-second decision to help strangers had transformed into a lifetime of purpose. Every day, mijo. Why? I'm glad it happened. I'm glad you saved Mr. George and Mrs. Norma. Me too, buddy, me too. As Carlos drove through Nashville toward Miguel's school, he passed the construction site where a new pediatric research facility was being built, funded in part by their benefit concerts. He passed the hospital where Miguel received his treatments, now expanded with a new wing for rare disease patients. He passed the recording studios and venues where country music legends continued to create the soundtrack for dreams and struggles and small victories. This city had once seemed like a place where he was destined to struggle and scrape for every small success. Now it felt like home in the deepest sense, not just a place where he lived, but a place where he belonged, where his work mattered, where his story had become part of something larger and more meaningful than he had ever imagined possible. At a red light, Carlos caught sight of an Uber driver in the lane next to him, a young man who looked tired and worried, probably wondering if he could make enough money that day to cover his bills, probably hoping that his next fare would bring him a little closer to whatever dream was keeping him going. Carlos smiled and whispered a prayer for that unknown driver, for all the people still fighting their own storms, still building their own bridges, one difficult day at a time. He knew now that extraordinary things were possible, that heroes existed in the most ordinary places, and that sometimes the worst nights of our lives become the first chapters of our greatest stories. The light turned green, and Carlos Mendonça drove on through his city, his son beside him, his future bright with purpose, his heart full of gratitude for the storm that had changed everything.